So I'd like to invite our other panelists up and presenters. We have our vendor panelists, and that's Rick Teen from Mission Secure and Michael Bova from Acronis. I'm just going to ask Rick and Michael to say a couple of words about who they are and what they do in their companies, just a little bit so we can familiarize ourselves with you.
Yeah, so my name is Mike Bova. I'm an enterprise account executive with Acronis, so working with Fortune 500 companies primarily on their OT environments, obviously like Boston Scientific. I know a lot of people, the piece yesterday morning heard my pitch. What we like to focus on is probably what you're concerned about with those legacy systems, ability to recover quickly and minimize downtime, and then ease of use of the product as well. Because if it's complicated, you're just going to make those OT guys upset, and that's the last thing you want to do for the easy implementation piece.
Thanks.
My name is Rick Teen with Mission Secure. I'm one of the vice presidents there. I have the role of being a subject matter expert in a few areas like the traffic management and smart cities area, as well as maritime. I also handle our partnerships. We really provide the full life cycle of OT cybersecurity. We use the term OT native cybersecurity because we really came up out of an OT project between the Air Force and the University of Virginia, were the original concepts behind our technology. So unlike a lot of cyber solutions in OT, which are adapted from IT, we come really native to the OT world. And one of the things that we really focus on is meeting the customer where they are, whether it be at the assessment and early stage level through that monitoring and awareness of what's going on, warnings and alerts, but then really being able to drive all the way through to true protection, all the way down to level 1, and even monitoring down to level 0, between level 1 and level 0. So really running the full life cycle of the OT process. And very proud to be here with one of our favorite clients, the City of Tampa, which will be, when this gets fully deployed, which, as we all know from driving on roads, traffic projects take a while. But when it's rolled out, Tampa will be the most cybersecure, OT cybersecure system in the world that we're aware of.
Great. Yeah, no, as I said, we're glad to have you here, too. We don't get a lot of these examples in smart city applications, as we like to call them. I encourage everybody to ask questions. I don't know if anybody in the audience has a question right now, but like I said before, it's kind of a rare opportunity to get end users up here to speak about their experience with OT-level cybersecurity. I know we have some users here in the audience and some other cybersecurity professionals, so please don't hold back. I want this to be an open discussion. I have questions here that I can go through, but I encourage everybody to ask some questions, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. So, to start our pre-canned questions here that we have, let's talk about what it takes to implement a successful disaster recovery plan and framework. I think we had sort of sent this question around earlier, and I'm wondering if you guys have any comments on your experience in implementing a disaster recovery plan, and what are the ingredients for success? And
Again, I would say that when you're working about DR, you're talking, when it's a bigger company, we're going to have lots of different applications and a lot of different application teams. And so what you've got to do is engage these folks. A lot of these folks that we have may or may not even understand that they need to have a disaster recovery plan until you actually bring it to them, right? And so basically what we're doing is we've gone out and done assessments to see, what do you have for a DR? What do you have out there? From there, we take an assessment of that, and then we go and we actually work with them. We work with these various teams to set up a DR plan and DR process so it can be ongoing and sustainable. With our resiliency play, what we've got right now too, DR is the place where we hope not to get to, but we hope not to ever need DR. So we put a lot of emphasis into basically monitoring of applications and say potentially like the high HA, how do you make sure your stuff stays up and stays clean, things with DR and different things like that, and just basically application health. But with the DR, it's just a matter of getting them to realize it, getting them to buy off on the idea you need to do it, you need to test it, you need to have your DR drills at some kind of a cadence, and be it every 6 months, be it every quarter, whatever you're going to do, whatever you think is needed for the particular application that you have based on its criticality. So.
Thanks. Brandon?
I'll say that as a municipality, we are fairly well structured to deal with disasters of all types. And we have a lot of exercises that are not cybersecurity related, but that put the framework in place and help us to practice like what we would do, even if that was mirrored in that cybersecurity type environment. So for us, using the NIMS framework and having an incident commander for whatever that incident or the disaster recovery process ends up being is pretty critical. And we practice that with, I mean, if we have a hurricane approaching, we practice it during what I mentioned earlier, the Gasparilla Parade, when we know there's going to be a huge number of people and a risk of some sort to the city. And we know that other agencies have exercised that NIMS protocol even in a cybersecurity breach response. So that's really where we would go. And for private sector entities and agencies, that might be something that you could consider trying to mirror in some way within your company.
Excellent. Yeah, please.
One very brief add to that would just be that one of those crossover benefits of a cybersecurity platform like ours is that because we actually sometimes refer to it as a living assessment tool as well, because we're constantly monitoring the OT side of the equation. For a lot of our customers, we discover is in the past they've had a SCADA system for this or a SCADA system for that. They've never had one picture of their whole OT, and that obviously would come in very handy were there to be a disaster recovery situation, because that would be another way to restructure. If you needed to rebuild parts of your OT network, we'd have a very good track record of what was there before. So.
Any other audience questions? Okay, oh, we have one right here. Excellent. And we got another one right here when that one's done.
You want to know where the other question is?
Oh, it's further up here, but please go ahead and just let us know who you are if you don't mind.
Yeah, John Cusimano with Deloitte. My question, I think, is to Brandon. You talked about having a solution to prevent the Italian job scenario, which what I remember from the movie was mass chaos with all the traffic lights turning green or something like that. And so I'm curious, being Italian, right? Have a vested interest. But I'm curious about if you can explain a little bit more about how that works, because most PLCs are controllers, even though they may be programmed with interlocks to prevent those situations. If somebody were to tamper with the code or come in and force a bit, you could theoretically override that. So it sounds like you have some other layer of protection that's preventing that unsafe scenario.
Yes, it's actually a hardwired device. It's a soldered card that identifies allowable what we call phase pairs in the industry parlance for a traffic signal. So it actually has a hard reset to our flash relay within the signal cabinet if you have conflicting greens or any conflicting indications coming up at the same time. However, that's not going to come into effect with a red-on-red scenario. That's actually a tool that we use within the signal cycle on an ongoing basis. So not to spill any secrets, but the opportunity for creating chaos comes more in the red-on-red scenario or the extension of that red-on-red scenario, whereas it still would be somewhat chaotic if you sent every signal to flash, but it just doesn't. There's just that extra layer of protection with what we call the conflict monitor within that cabinet. That's a separate device.
Just to add to that just a little bit. First of all, I guess I may have seen the movie too many times, but it's an entertaining one. Yeah, it's funny because actually in the movie, the green on green scenario is just done when they're goofing around. The actual scenario they use is to have an escape route, so it doesn't involve the green on green in the movie, just to be specific. But it just shows that you can really do a lot with a system short of green on green. Also, the green on green has been proven to not be 100% impossible to overcome. It's very rare. It requires certain scenarios, certain parameters to be in place, but it can be defeated. It's one of the reasons why in a traffic system, we don't currently use our level 1, level 0 tool, because they've already got something that works pretty effectively there, whereas in other industries we would. But you can do a lot of damage with the traffic system, without the green-on-green scenario to create an extremely difficult situation. And one of the things in the industry that's funny is that there have been introduced newer versions of the conflict monitor, which are software-based, which any hacker will be thrilled to find out that they're moving away from the old-fashioned card, which is physically impossible to beat, and to a software platform.
Yeah, and I'll say that's like I mentioned, for decades, that's really kind of what we relied on. It's, even if somebody were to get into our system, all they could do is send it to Flash. Well, if you do that on a network basis, that's a huge problem. And if we ever get to the point where people figure out how to get around that conflict monitor, I wouldn't say it's 100% fail-safe, but it's a very solid system. There are greater implications to that.
Thanks. Do we have another question?
You said there was somebody up front.
I thought I saw somebody with their hand up front here, but I could have been wrong.
Oh, I was just, it's like giving a challenge here to people. Can you break that?
Okay.
The green.
Sid, if you have any questions, go ahead and ask them. So let's talk about cost justification. I find there's a lot of parallels between what's happening in OT level cybersecurity right now and what was happening in the world of, say, process safety, right? Maybe 15 years ago, where it's really tough to go to your boss and say, this is something that we need because we might be vulnerable, something might happen, and the typical argument is, well, our plant hasn't blown up before, or we haven't had a major incident before, so why do we need this now? Can you guys offer us some words of wisdom and maybe some tips for success as far as cost justifying implementing these cybersecurity solutions?
Yeah, that's a good question, right? That's a tough one. And
Yeah.
Sadly, what I've found to be true is that there's an incident of some kind that opens people's eyes. And that's worst case scenario, of course. But what you can try to do is you try to use these incidents to raise awareness to the folks that are in charge and the folks that need to make the decisions that it is critical. Especially at Boston Scientific, the number of incidents keep going up, and you can point right to it, and you can see that the medical device industry has been getting attacked quite a bit more than it was in the past. Mm-hmm. So you can use those to justify it, but even with that, you still get a lot of naysayers that, again, if the house isn't on fire, I don't need to fix it, and they don't need to secure it unless you do that. But with what I do is what I have been doing is I put together, for a lack of a better term, a little dog and pony show that I would take out to the various sites to actually kind of explain to them, why cybersecurity is important. You talk about your defense in depth and things like that, and you can show them. Usually, especially in our manufacturing, we're selling stuff. It's all about money, right? So it shows, hey, if downtime is going to cause you this much pain, right? So if you can justify that a little bit, that kind of hits them where it hurts, and that's where they want to see, and that's where they kind of want to justify what you've got. So it's not really scare them, but it kind of is scare them a little bit, right? And so I just had a session with a bunch of senior leadership, and that's how he kind of ended. He goes, okay, I'm thoroughly scared. Right, and so that's what I kind of do with mine. So,
yeah, and I would just kind of add to that, right? It is as you get higher up the chain, it is do you want to stay out of the news? Because who knew who JBS was and who knew who Colonial Pipeline was before 2021? But then that fear of not getting your pork chops or not getting your gas on the East Coast all of a sudden because of ransomware and malware, that's a big piece. So it's, do you want to pay now or do you want to pay later? Not to maybe put it that bluntly, but sometimes you have to justify it. And it's not an if something happens, it's when something happens. Let's make sure we're prepared. Let's make sure we get these systems back up and running, because downtime is money. And if there's one thing that everyone recognizes, it's that loss of money, and that being in the news is not going to be good for the company at all.
I think for me, our situation's a little bit different in that, listening to several of the presentations today, a lot of times the cybersecurity strategy is more of a top-down strategy, whereas where I am, I'm just in charge of a small piece of our OT layer. I'm just one of the functional areas within the city. And so I don't know if I said, I don't have any cybersecurity background. I'm just a traffic engineer with a concern that I'm trying to pay attention to and address. And within our structure, I have some capital money that is somewhat flexible. So there is an opportunity for me to sort of direct those things. So I'm in a fortunate position that way. The other thing is the ATMS project that I mentioned, that's something that we decided that we wanted to leverage to address our concern. It's a $40 million project. The cybersecurity piece of that is a very small part of it. It's a line item within a fairly significant project. So finding those opportunities to leverage other people's money and other people's projects and other people's processes is really important if you want to scale quickly.
And to follow up with that too, yeah, it is a top-down, but I think I've found some benefit in trying to communicate at various levels, right? Because you're going to find that you have levels of leadership across any kind of a company that you've got. The more you can get your boots on the ground folks engaged with their leadership and then the senior leadership, if you get everybody thinking and talking the same way, that goes a long way, because if someone comes in and says, hey, you need to do this, that's one thing. But one of their own people come in and say, hey, I think we need to do this, you kind of get more bang for your buck when you have everyone pushing the same direction within like an organization. It's like a manufacturing site. So if you get everyone wanting to do the same thing, you get more people saying they want it, it gets more ears.
And I'll just add one thing on the tip of the Tampa project. Actually, it's become a bit of a model that's being discussed within the traffic world as other conferences and all as being a very desirable way to do things. The original idea was they were going to roll out their ATMS project and then buy cyber to add onto it later. And then they realized that was silly, just put the requirement in the core project. And that was originally done. The original efficiency that was hoped to be gained by that was not having to go to your bosses and ask for more money and maybe speed up the timeline a little bit, but it's ended up having multiple positive ramifications in just the cost of the project. Instead of going out in the field and putting cybersecurity in cabinets that are already deployed, the cybersecurity is being built in the warehouse before they're put out in the, that sort of thing. And also, I think one thing that's kind of funny that you said to me once before is that everyone knew you had $40 million to spend, and when you added the cybersecurity requirement, the price tag didn't really go up. So, they put it on the bidders to say, find a way to add the cyber requirement into what you were already planning to give us, and you still know what our cap is in cost. And they were able to do that. So really, you can, to some degree, push the headache to the bidders by simply saying, every project we do, we're going to try to address cybersecurity as we do it. And it just becomes, as you said, a line item, not a project of its own.
Right. Always better to bake it in, right, than bolt it on, right?
Exactly.
And we talked about this before. We're big proponents of secure by design and, intrinsically secure products if you can get them. It's always better to build that in and not bolt it on afterwards, because then you got a whole other project on your hands and a whole bunch of headaches.
Larry?
Yeah, you got a question, Sid?
Yeah, I have a question. As I've been listening, particularly with Boston Scientific, but I think it's also relevant to Tampa. But, as you mentioned, there's a lot of interest in medical devices today. Mm-hmm. And I know, there's a lot of regulations that require certain cybersecurity issues when it comes to all kinds of things medical, including devices. I thought there were regulations. That's not an area I personally cover, but I assume there were. And I'm just surprised that, because one part is the device, whatever it is. The other part is the manufacturing of the device. And we see a lot of concerns about, you can always introduce problems into the device through the manufacturing process. So I'm just surprised. And so anyhow, if you can comment on the regulation side of that. And then as a follow-up, just same topic, I know that I don't know of any, I don't follow traffic either, but, you know, in the public sector, with all of the emphasis today, particularly like Homeland Security, I don't know if you were here yesterday for the presentation, but, you know, Clint Walker from CISA was here, you know, which was DHS, now it's a separate organization, but, you know, there's a big interest in the government about public safety, and I would think traffic is a public safety thing. I'm just surprised that there aren't regulations forcing you to do cybersecurity. So anyhow, if you could just comment on it. Okay,
Sure,
both
sure,
of
I
you?
can start. I don't want to make it sound like there is no cybersecurity, right? What we've got is, I know at Boston, they have a whole wing of people in our security team that's strictly for those devices, right? Devices that are that go into folks, right? The wands that are used to check devices, all these things that are out in the field. There are heavier regulations for those types of devices. I was focusing more on your infrastructure devices, your machinery in the background, your manufacturing stuff to build devices, right? So that was kind of where I was focusing. But yeah, I mean, the FDA has to approve a lot of things. Yeah, as far as cybersecurity, that's becoming more and more prevalent. I heard cyber insurance mentioned before too, and that's a big driver because folks can't get insured unless they, you know, kind of create some of this OT stuff or show that they're actually moving towards the right direction in that. But yeah, so Boston Scientific does have cybersecurity, and especially there's lots of rigor that goes into what they do for those devices that get implanted into people.
But there aren't similar ones for the manufacturer.
I don't know if you could answer that more, but
There is a level of, obviously, quality engineering validation that goes into the workstations, validating the process, the software, the hardware, all of that kind of plays together. Cybersecurity, I think, is becoming...
Validation that's required by the government?
External, yes.
Okay,
Government validation as well as internal validation as well. So cybersecurity, I think, is becoming more prevalent there, but that's not necessarily a focus area on the validation of the process functioning as intended. But that said, yes, Boston Scientific is very focused right now, and for a number of years, on the security state of our OT environment, and especially the impact that security products can have. You know, when you're talking about manufacturing products, obviously the interests are different between IT and OT, and you need the reliability, you need the uptime, and more importantly, you need the performance, you know, because that leads to line output. And with real-time antivirus technologies, we found a great hindrance on many of our systems. So obviously, that's with maybe some more traditional scanning technologies. Nowadays, you've got some other technologies that we are looking at, we are implementing with a much lower impact. And actually, one of those products also is Acronis' cyber protection. We ran that through the rigor and saw 4 to 5 times improvement on their real-time capabilities and the protection capabilities. Not saying that we are or aren't implementing that security product. We are using them for the disaster recovery, but that impact was very important, and proving that to our leadership and the engineering stakeholders and stuff is important as you're going down that security journey.
And what about my question about the public safety?
So
I worry now that I'm going to drive down the road. And I'm going to get caught with the Italian. I'm not Italian, so
I think
Snipkin's not an Italian.
I think when you start going down any cybersecurity rabbit hole, your eyes can get kind of wide and you get a little bit fearful about the possibilities. I mean, there's not a whole lot of regulation for traffic control devices for cybersecurity that I'm aware of. There are some market forces that sort of help police that on a self-regulatory basis, and I would anticipate down the road that there may be additional cybersecurity regulations. But when it comes to traffic controllers, there's probably a half dozen manufacturers who make all of the controllers across the U.S. And for us, we're a sole source shop, so they have a fairly significant incentive to make sure that their devices are secure, because if we can't trust them, then we'll move to something else. Now, the risk that I see is that as we get more cloud-based platforms and analytics packages and VPN connections, that they may find there's a threat that they didn't account for, and you know, just the same sort of organic cyber threats that emerge everywhere, but there's really not a whole lot of regulation that actually I'm aware of specifically in the transportation sector for cybersecurity. Maybe Rick knows more.
Is transportation the same, metros and, I mean, I
Well,
understand the use case you're talking about, but what about metros, rail, other?
There may be a little more happening there, but in the traffic transportation world specifically, first of all, I do want to mention that Tampa's vendor, it's a good thing to note, they were very welcoming of this. They are aware that there are vulnerabilities inherent in the design that they can't do anything about. It's just simply the design of OT. And so they were very welcoming, cooperative of our work with them there, and we worked together elsewhere. One of the things that is interesting from a federal regulation point of view, it's moving in the right direction, but it started from a really, really far back the track. Actually, interestingly, a few years ago,
The gas one? you're talking
well, I was approached. Just a good example is about 3 or so years ago, I was approached by the head lobbyist of an organization called the ITSA, Intelligent Transportation Systems of America, and what he wanted from me was to help him write some language to submit to Congress to get added into clarification that it's okay to spend infrastructure money on cybersecurity, because they were actually hearing from people in the cities and states saying, I'm not sure I'm allowed. You've given me all this money to upgrade my traffic system. Am I allowed to use it on cybersecurity? So what we've seen in the last few years is progress from a clarification going out and saying, yes, you are allowed to in the more recent, IJIS or whatever, if I'm getting the acronym right, bill, there actually was a language being put in there that several of us contributed towards to basically say you're encouraged to use cybersecurity, some of this money for cybersecurity. So it's moving in the right direction. They have not gotten to required, but at least it's moving in the right direction.
Yeah, it just surprised. I mean, I'm just surprised. That's why I asked the question, because, I've been very impressed with DHS, the cybersecurity part of it, which is CISA now. But anyhow, for the longest time, there was an organization there. The government was supporting and encouraging cybersecurity in critical infrastructure areas, but it was more like just passing information out. That's how I saw it. I apologize if I'm misrepresenting that, but now they're much more proactive. I mean, they've been to our conference twice. They want to talk. They want to, and the message is always, if you need any help, please contact. They're encouraging it. So there seems to be a big government push on cybersecurity, and I think things like Colonial Pipeline, which is completely different, but you see the impact. And one of the great things they had, the fellow who was speaking here, Clint Walker, he spoke last year and this year, but he has this really nice presentation where he talks about the butterfly effect. And he talked about, a pipeline goes down, but then that has the problem that now you don't have fuel for emergency vehicles. You don't have fuel for it was enormous impact. And so anyhow, I was just surprised. That's why I was asking.
When it comes to critical infrastructure, everything's connected. That was his point. You can't get the fuel through the pipeline. You can't fuel the ambulances for emergency response. You can't put planes in the air. And it always surprised me that there is practically no regulation related to cybersecurity in any industry, unless you look at NERC for the bulk power system. And even then, that only applies to the bulk power system. It doesn't apply to the entire scope of the power industry. So most of what's going on today in all industries is pretty much voluntary,
Yeah, I'm not
which I
gonna-
think is amazing that we've actually done as much as we've done without this regulation. So, yeah.
I'm not going to propose a question. I'm going to continue this conversation a little bit to bring in a little bit more color and context to it.
Sure.
In the 1930s, FERC was created because of a blackout. In 2003, NERC was created because of a blackout. TSA pipeline guidelines were created because of colonial pipelines. Regulatory, from the perspective of the United States, I'm from Canada, and I'll state this is the different geographical regions have different regulatory controls. So if we go over into Europe, we would talk about the NIST directives. NIST directives in Europe have been dealing with regulatory compliance across all 16 critical infrastructures for the last 5 years. They're about to bring out NIST Directive 2. And with that is that what ended up happening is the EU went through and built all this regulatory framework for all of the critical infrastructures. Then each one of the member states had responsibilities of being able to deploy that that regulatory compliance. So in transportation in Europe, you are regulated. In Canada, there's Bill C-26 at this particular point in time that is in Parliament, and that will cover off the critical infrastructures of what the government can touch. The challenge that we have in the United States is very different than the other geographical regions, is that each regulatory authority has to deal with each different industry. So NERC is backed by FERC, which is backed by DOE. TSA goes back into the DHS. And so with that, it's just that you won't have regulatory compliance across all critical infrastructures in the US until such a time that we start seeing attacks and successful attacks, and then at that point, regulation will come. It's just the difference in the nature of the politics in the US in comparison to the politics in other geographical regions. European politics aren't as divisive, and therefore then they are able to come together, whereas North American politics and Canada, our politics are becoming more divisive as well, right? So with that, what we all have to be prepared for is regulatory frameworks will come across all critical infrastructures, because every other global region other than the United States is doing that today.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would say I was fine. I was just reading. I started to read the article about the new European stuff yesterday. I got distracted, so I've still got it open on my computer to finish reading. And that was very encouraging that that's happening there. The one thing I will say is one of the phrases we use, and this is not in any way denigrating compliance, but that is wonderful and it needs to move the direction. Is compliance isn't in and of itself security. It's a step on the way. It's always outdated, it's always a compromise, but it's sure better to have it than not have it. But we always encourage people, don't just shoot, your target isn't compliance. Compliance is a way station, and you keep going beyond that. But yeah, we absolutely need more. And I don't know, maybe I need to book some flights over to Europe and get up to Canada where there's more regulation so we can move more quickly. But I absolutely agree with that.
Or hope for somebody to come up with the Italian, whatever that phrase was, to cause
We
that.
have people on our team
Cause
who
that
do
in
it.
Tampa or anywhere. I live around DC.
We have
so
folks
not
on our
that-
team who could do it, but we're going to maintain our ethics.
I absolutely agree that compliance isn't security. I've been doing security for 25 years of my life, and being able to work the globe from, we're looking at the regulatory frameworks, it all comes down to the competency of the regulator who's regulating you, and then at that point, the competency of the end user customer who is going to align to it, and then its interpretation. And interpretation can be wild, and that's why we have people like Deloitte in the room who can help you understand how to become compliant. And so the key thing that we all have to take away from this is that we all have strong frameworks that we can follow from a perspective of security, and that we should all be following those types of frameworks, because in the end, if we don't do appropriate security measures, we're not going to be secure. And no matter what we do from a security perspective, as time goes on, we become more insecure as time goes on. Therefore, then we need to be able to have continuous security programs to be able to ensure that absolute, not absolute, absolute's the wrong word, that security. We will always be breached. We always need to assume breach. We need to be able to really get to the point where the governments don't have to regulate us, that we make and do that self-regulation ourselves to be able to put the appropriate security measures in place. And I don't want to make it sound like I'm a part of the panel or anything like that, but I wanted to comment on it because nobody was bringing up those other regulatory bodies. It's happening in EMEA and APAC as well, right?
I think that was great
I have
commentary.
no other questions.
If anybody else has anything to say, please speak up. I want this to be an open discussion. You know, there's not a lot of rules here, so if you have something to say, within reason, of course, go ahead and say it. Yeah, the thing that concerns me about regulatory frameworks is, like with NERC SIP, you know, maybe the users get more focused on checking the boxes, right? What do I have to do to minimally comply to this thing versus how do I build and maintain a good cybersecurity organization? And that's kind of the trap that we fall into. So hopefully, you know, whatever future regulations come along, you know, won't get us into this trap. But I want to get back to Boston Scientific, because you said something interesting in your presentation, that you had to define what OT cybersecurity was, right? Did I hear that correctly? Could you give me some comments on how you went through that exercise and you know, some of the challenges?
Sure. I'm actually still going through this exercise, but what I meant is that within Boston Scientific, we have a lot of different we've got our security team, we've got our business leaders, we've got our infrastructure people, and they all have different designs on what OT means, right? Is OT a support mechanism? Is OT, just applied to manufacturing things? There's lots of things that can happen. Like our security team, they're more concerned with, firewall management per se, for an example of something where like the business, they really don't care necessarily about firewall management at all, right? So when you're building up this OT group, what is going to be in this? Because right now, we've got OT spread across all of our sites, and we've got, basically, they're doing their own stuff, site by site. They're kind of doing what they want to do with minimal input from, like, say, infrastructure. And so what they're trying to do is we're trying to globalize this to the point where we do have an overarching body that can kind of push down protocol, push down processes, push down applications, things like that can be used. When you're starting from scratch, I'm running into problems where, and this sounds terrible, but it's like everyone thinks it's a great idea, but nobody wants to pay for it and own it, right? So nobody wants to own the OT thing. Infrastructure doesn't want to own it. Business doesn't want to own it. Security doesn't necessarily want to own it. But someone has to own it, because if you have like too many owners, you have no owners, right? And so that I'm coming in from a guerrilla perspective, saying, hey, we need to get this off the ground to give some legitimacy or formality to an OT team. And to do that, we need to start somewhere. And so I'm kind of stuck in a circle a little bit.
Yeah.
And so now what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to convince all the parties involved, all the different various pillars that we've got, that this is where we start. That's phase 0, here's phase 1, here's phase 2, and then get everyone to buy off on it, right? So that's kind of what I meant by that comment.
Yeah, and that's a good way to look at it, and you got to get that buy-in
Right.
from the stakeholders and everything like we saw in the last session. That's all important, yeah.
I would also say, and what we run into a lot, is the IT-OT convergence, because I think at Boston Scientific and a lot of other companies and partners that we work with, if you're bringing in a new software, all of a sudden the InfoSec team wants to test it, but they're testing it like it's an IT type of software rather than, OT. So helping them understand exactly what it's for. I like to say a lot of times IT downtime causes disruptions, OT downtime causes the business to stop, right? You're not making any money if OT is not running. So having that understanding and being able to communicate that with teams within the organization who might not be as familiar with the true manufacturing part of things is, back to Mark's point, communication is key. That's always important as well.
Good comments. I got a question for Brandon. What was it the first, I've covered smart cities at ARC for a couple of years. I cover building automation systems. I mean, the state of cybersecurity in smart cities and building automation is pretty dismal, at the OT level. Nothing to do with you, but, most of what I've seen is, they're way far behind, as a sector, compared to refining and oil and gas and, a lot of, discrete manufacturing and so forth. So what was it that made you think that we need security now? What was the trigger that got you started on this?
Yeah, it was Rick. I can't take personal credit for it, to be honest. I had a very forward-thinking predecessor in my position who really tasked us with piloting the mission secure appliance first, and then we went from there. But it's something that I think that we have a sort of general awareness of, and you may find that there's more of an awareness of that need across the industry, just a lack of funding and motivation to pursue where that awareness and that concern goes to, just because of the lack of attacks and the lack of visibility as it comes to making those decisions. I think it really just comes down to that.
Yeah, I can add there was a little bit of backstory to it before I met Brandon. I actually, there were 3 connected vehicle pilot programs sponsored by the US DOT. One was in New York City, one was on a stretch of highway in Wyoming, and the third, I want to say the third, was in Tampa. And when the US DOT found out what Mission Secure could do, and what the real risk landscape was and how we could protect against it, they asked me to contact New York and Tampa. They didn't feel it was as much value in the Wyoming thing. And New York's a whole other story I'll tell people over a beer, but that wasn't really worth pursuing. But Tampa was interesting because they put us in touch with the people on the CV project. And the answer I kept getting was, we're not sure who you should talk to, but we're being told that the traffic grid system is secure. You know, we're connecting this new CV stuff to it, but I think they said it was secure. But you can, and eventually they said you can talk to this guy Vic Beatty, who Brandon's referring to, and I got Vic on the phone, and they said what? I've been trying to tell them it's an inherently incredibly insecure system, and we're attaching connected vehicle technology to it. We shouldn't be. And so that's what led to him wanting to test our equipment, prove the concept that it worked, and really one thing led to another from there. So it was the spur of CV and AV that helped. And that's one of the things that we definitely see as a concern in the traffic and transportation industry is all the buzz and excitement and the money is going towards connected and autonomous vehicles, which is all great, but a tiny sliver of it should be carved off and first secure the existing infrastructure, because everybody talks about, oh, you can hack a vehicle. Yes, you can hack a vehicle. People on our team have done it. It's very difficult, and now you've hacked one vehicle. It's incredibly easy to hack a citywide traffic grid, and then you can influence all the vehicles, the connected more so than the non-connected, but really to some degree all of them. So that's where that first step should be: get that house cleaned up, then add the CV and AV on top of it. And that may be one of the things, Sid, that can be tied in with the idea of regulation. Before we go forward, honestly, with launching heavy, extensive CV and AV, there should be a push to modernize the cybersecurity stance of the OT.
Yeah, I live in Virginia, a DC, where, what do you call it? Where all the bedroom community out of DC now. And so I'm aware of all the bad decision making that can be done there. But isn't it just, as you were talking, isn't it just ludicrous to me that we have had all this hype and talking about connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, which obviously have to connect to other vehicles, connect to traffic systems and everything else, and nobody's ever even given a thought or done anything about saying, let's at least make sure that's secure. I mean, we've been talking about that for I don't know how long, huh, Larry? And I would hear people talking, and I'm not personally big on the autonomous vehicles, not because, I just don't see the need for it, okay? I think that's putting the cart ahead of the horse. But I'm not against electric, but don't misunderstand me. I'm just saying, I just think we're kind of complicated.
It can be amazing. I was at a conference in Detroit a couple of years ago, and there was a panel talking about CV and AV, and I knew a couple of panel members, so I sort of teed them up with some questions from the audience to talk about how they needed funding and support to upgrade their cyber stance. And the guy who was the moderator was from Industry Magazine, and we got out in the hallway afterwards, and we're milling around talking, and he turns to me and said, you're really effective at getting people to be scared about the cyber risks before we go into CV and AV. And as I was saying thank you, he said, you got to stop doing that.
Yes, that's
we
as
we
you
need to
said, I
move
got the
forward as
point.
fast as we can on this, and we can't have you mucking up things on that. And luckily, all the other panelists sided with me and said, no, we just need to take a breath, do a little bit of work first, and at most we'll delay the process 6 months. And one of the things that I pointed out to him was, it's been amazing to me that in the CV and AV world, one of the things that you have to accept is that occasionally a connected or autonomous vehicle is going to kill someone who would not have otherwise been killed. Statistically, it's going to be a tiny fraction of the people who don't get killed. But it's really hard to deal with, the fact that some person who wouldn't have otherwise died. The public has been amazing about this, I think. Now it's happened a couple of times. And the public has not freaked out over this. But my point to him was, what if the next one isn't an accident? What if the next one was intentional? Or it's a crowd that a truck gets driven into, or anything like that? Then I think the reaction will be no CVAV for 10 years. It will be a moratorium. And so just do the little bit of work to secure the underlying systems first, and everyone will be better off.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, good point.
I'll add that in defense of the industry, it's, I wouldn't say it's quite that dire. It's not a great picture. I think most other agencies, to the extent that they are trying to put resources into it, are trying to better encapsulate those cabinets, those endpoints in the field, whether that's through just a different traditional key. Years ago, we switched from that key that opens 90% of traffic signals, signal cabinets. There are CyberLock devices that people are implementing as well. You know, that's a different layer that they're trying to protect, but it's not a lack of care or a complete blind eye to it. It's just a different approach.
You know, when you told that little story about the key, I don't know if it was here, Larry, at our conference, but it was somewhere where I saw somebody speaking about cybersecurity, but it was a guy who, it's one of these companies where they're paid to try to break in, okay, to hack, you know, I mean, cyber-wise. But anyhow, you know, I mean, the guy got in the door with no problem. He got the janitor or something to open the door, you know, but it was social tricking him, you know, that kind of stuff. But then he got in and he got to the cabinets, to the security room, and he had this bunch of keys with him, and he just picked one, and it was this master key, and you know, it was ridiculous because it was the one key, and not only did it open the door, it opened every cabinet in the room and everything else, but it was one key. And you know, and talk about things. That's what I always think of. I always say to people, you know, I'm always amazed by magicians. I don't care how smart you are. There's somebody who can outsmart you, you know, and
Yeah.
not because you're not smart, it's just that they do things in a way that you just, maybe you're trusting it this way, or, so
Well,
somebody
it's
can
good
do
to
that.
know we're not alone, but I'm not sure if I should feel better or worse.
Yeah, right,
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Oh, I don't know if you've seen that show, Mr. Robot, but they're trying to break into what is essentially Iron Mountain. And they're saying this place is impenetrable. There's no vulnerabilities. And the main character is looking at all the people walking around. He's like, I see about 6 of them walking around right now. You know, social engineering is a pretty powerful thing. So, yeah. Anybody else in the audience have a question? I'm starting to run out of questions here.
It's already 25 after, so.
Huh?
It's already 25 after.
Yeah, it's already 25 after. I think we're probably going to call it now. It's been a great discussion. I really appreciate you guys coming. Great job presenting, and thanks to the vendor sponsors for having these end user clients come in here. Like I said, it's really tough to get end users to come and speak, and we really appreciate you being here. So let's give a hand to our presenters and our panelists, and hopefully we'll see you again next year.